Physically and emotionally, how well or sick is he?
I do not have a clear answer to that, but I have contacts and friends still in Eastern Europe who think that there is something fundamentally wrong with him medically, but I'm not a clinician. I think
such as they've talked to
probably Parkinson's, which of course has different representations, different variations, different seriousness. But if the man is paranoid, and I think the murder of Navalny might suggest a certain paranoia. That is one of the symptoms.
You've anticipated my next question before we move on. It was murder, Navalny.
I think one has to conclude it was definitely murder.
Hannah's in Yeovil. Hannah, you're on the radio. What's your question?
Hello, Nick. So, Richard, the nuclear deterrent seems to work in Putin's favour in that every time he rattles a nuclear sabre, we do nothing, and our fear of escalation is based on his nuclear threats. I'm not quite sure where we go from here because we have a nuclear deterrent and it doesn't seem to be deterring him.
What would be your direct question there? That Putin's taking advantage of this, Hannah? Could I phrase it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Taking advantage.
The nuclear threats have been made more by Medvedev, who is, let's say, one of the puppets that Putin uses to sort of rattle the nuclear sabre. I think, it's a complicated issue because we're talking here about deterrence. On the Western side, we have our nuclear capability there. We have the American nuclear umbrella over Europe, and that is a massive deterrent. So I don't think at this point these are serious threats coming in terms of, let's say, use of strategic weapons. The concern in Ukraine has been the use of a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. And I think that it's quite interesting that the threat of that use has not materialized, largely because one, I think, takes the view that the downside for Putin, if he used such a weapon, is massive. And there would be American escalation, and there would certainly be huge Chinese disapproval as well. So it would change his strategic position. So at the moment, I think this is more an exchange of threats and ideas than it is an actual problem. That situation may change if the situation becomes more serious, but not at the moment.
What do we take, Sir Richard, from the photographs in the newspapers today? Putin taking a joyride in a supersonic, Tu-160M, if I'm saying that correctly, nuclear bomber yesterday. A pre-election stunt that's meant to taunt the West, I read. Is that a fair interpretation?
I think that's a fair interpretation. Look, we've seen pictures of him on horseback, showing his man-pack. Look, Putin has always postured. That's part of his character. And the rumours of his illness maybe make it more important now that he postures in a way which suggests that he isn't ill, if he is. So this is not a change; it's something he's been doing.
When Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, far back in the summer of 2022, he told me that Putin had issued his colleagues had issued 35 threats of nuclear attack of some kind since the war had begun a few months earlier. Are we closer to a nuclear attack now? Do you think those threats continue?
No, I don't think that. The threats are still there, but I don't think there's been an escalation towards a nuclear exchange. Let's make that distinction.
Firoz is in Wembley. Go ahead, Firoz. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Nick.
Hello, sir.
Good morning, Sir Richard. I've got a question that all lives are very important, and war kills a lot of people. Now, for that reason, I hate war. Now, in your views, what is the diplomatic solution for this war, please?
A diplomatic solution. I think difficult with the man in Russia, in the Kremlin.
I think at the moment, unfortunately, and you mentioned the loss of human life, which is massive, it's difficult to imagine a solution. And I think particularly on the Ukrainian side, because they suffered the aggression, the Ukrainians, and I was there in the summer, are not ready to compromise. They're not in a position where they're going to accept a compromise. They have suffered massive losses, and the Russians are prepared to take massive losses to try to pursue whatever their strategic objectives are in Ukraine. So we're in a very, very difficult position. The conflict haven't reached a point yet where there is either the diplomatic pressure or the desire on either side of the battlefield for a compromise. So that's what's so tragic about this war. The losses are just huge. I mean, the Russian losses may be somewhere in the region of between 300,000 and 400,000. We're not quite sure. On the Ukrainian side, they're certainly 200,000. And that's not deaths, that's injured and deaths. So we are in an extraordinary situation. I mean, this is very, very serious in terms of the sort of cost of the conflict.
Let's expand. Thank you, Firoz. Let's expand a little bit. When NATO Admiral Rob Bauer said about a month ago that civilians in Europe need to prepare for an all-out war with Russia within the next 2 decades, within the next 20 years, Sir Richard, is he right?
Well, if you wish for peace, prepare for war. I think to that extent he is right. I mean, NATO needs to get its act together.
What do you mean? I've got to get a bit more detail. What do you mean get its act together? What does it need to do? It's not doing.
Well, let us take the example of Finland that's joined NATO. It's got a professional army which is very small, somewhere in the region, I think, of 20 to 30,000. It's got a civilian army which it can mobilise in a very short period of time of over 1 million, and a very performant and highly trained army. We have run down our armed forces in the UK, and I think we're all worried that if we had to face a crisis, how would we build and how quickly could we build up our military forces? And I think people have not thought about these problems. And if you take the major armies of Europe, they're based on civilian call-up, the classic example being Switzerland, where Switzerland could put several million men into uniform in a very short period of time. All Swiss men have to do a certain amount of army service. And I think we have to maybe, I'm not talking about national service, but maybe we have to change the terms by which we encourage people to take on a military role and military training. I mean, for example, one of the ideas I would put forward is if, for example, you join the army for 2 years, maybe for 4 after that, you've got a moratorium on your income tax. I mean, there are ways that you can create an incentive, which I think would be very successful.
So that would be voluntary then, Sir Richard? It's not a national service.
No,
but
no, it would be
it's
voluntary.
Very exciting. I'll get 4 years tax-free if I do 2 years in the military
why
and prepare
not?
for call-up.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's say tax-free up to a salary of 60,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
And then do an annual training period of 3 weeks to keep up your military skills. I mean, it would be very, very easy in the UK to do this.
So, coming back to the UK's military position now, are the lights flashing red on our dashboard as regards our preparedness?
I think they are. And, we have run down our armed forces. Look at the state of the Navy. The number of capital ships that we have, it's appalling. Look at the size of the armed forces. Look at the size of the army. I mean, this is very, very worrying. We can't depend on sophisticated kit. The war in Ukraine makes it absolutely clear that boots on the ground are an essential part of an effective military.
Well, you always need the army to actually take the territory you win, don't you? You need the boys and girls to actually hold the land you've got.
Absolutely.
How concerned were you? We learnt in the middle of this week that there was a test firing of a Trident missile some months ago, and it managed to get up, but then it turned around and crashed into the sea almost next to the submarine that had launched it. You talk about the effectiveness of our Navy. How concerned were you by that report, Sir Richard?
Well, sophisticated weapons do fail from time to time. There have been 190 tests of Trident, if you count the American tests, and I think it's a pretty reliable weapon system. Look, sometimes when you fire a rocket, the boosters don't work, and I think that's probably what happened in this particular case.
Does it still represent value for money?
I think it's a necessary expenditure. We still need our strategic nuclear deterrent.
We're halfway through our time together. Tell my listeners about one decision, then. What exactly does that feature? This is your podcast.
Well, it's very kind of you to ask, Nick.
No,
One Decision is a geopolitical podcast. They come out weekly. I do it with a young journalist called Julia McFarlane. We do a team. We're a team together. We interview extraordinary people, and then we have a commentary on the significance of that interview. Garry Kasparov, the chess player, an opponent of Putin, we did recently. I think my next one due is with Kwasi Kwarteng.
Okay.
We've done a whole lot of very eminent people, and we have a big listenership, and I urge you to listen to our words of wisdom. You'll learn a lot. It's a great podcast.
Thanks, Sir Richard. John's in Ruislip. You're through to Sir Richard Dearlove. Go ahead, John.
Hello, good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Richard, a question to you. You know very well that Putin is a mafia boss. You know his history from the beginning till today. Why the Europe doesn't stop this? My wife is from Ukraine. I know the things from inside out. I live there in Ukraine. And your role is very important to explain to our politicians and wake up, gentlemen, do not be too late.
What is it you think that the people are not doing, calling him out as a mafia boss? Is that what you're saying, John? Just so I clarify.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
So,
and the Europe, the politicians are scared, don't do enough to Ukraine.
Okay. So, Richard, are we calling him out, to use that modern idiom, enough?
Well, we could certainly call him out more. And if we had any doubt about what he's like, we've now got the latest event, which is the murder of Navalny in the prison camp in the Arctic. I don't know what exactly to say in reply to you, because I think we all understand what he's like. And
right.
I mean, what's important for the West now is to support Ukraine. And the problem is that for political reasons, the Americans are standing back on that support. And the latest American subvention of $60 billion, which is essential for the Ukrainians in terms of supply and armament, is held up in the US Congress. And I mean, similarly, there are other countries in Europe which have been reluctant or unable politically to throw their full weight behind support for Ukraine. For example, Germany.
All right. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to the emails, texts, tweets and X's as they are now for some questions. This comes in from Rachel in Bexley. Could you ask Sir Richard to rate in terms of potential danger to the United Kingdom, China, Russia and North Korea?
Well, I think one can put it in a direct, I think Russia first, for obvious reasons at the moment, China next, and then North Korea. And they're all, in their own way, problematic.
What are the concerns? We can see, obviously, Russia writ large, and we've talked about it for the last 15 minutes. What are your concerns with China?
I think our concerns with China are long-term. It's what is the intention of China globally within the international security system. And, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, and, I stress it is very strictly run by the Chinese Communist Party at its 20th Congress, made it quite clear, if you read the documentation, that the country is set on world domination by, I think, 2050 was the date that they gave, or 2049. So we have a strategic problem with China, but at the same time, our economies are intertwined. So how do we strike the balance between a trading relationship with China and a strategic relationship which doesn't give them the advantage that they seek over us?
Dan in Hastings, can Sir Richard explain the terrible loss of Israeli intelligence prior to the October 7th attacks? That's, of course, always assuming that, Sir Richard, you subscribe to the view that there was a failure of Israeli intelligence. What happened? Obviously, I remind listeners it's some years since you were in post, but what's your view on that?
I think my view on it was that there was a certain complacency. I'm going to be quite careful here in what I say. I think that the Israeli military, and that is separate from Mossad, put massive dependence on having built a wall around Gaza, which was, let's say, largely technical in terms of its coverage of the threat to Israel. And there was too much reliance on technical intelligence and insufficient reliance on human sources inside Hamas. So the Israelis were taken by surprise. There was an intelligence failure. I'm not the only person to have said that. My good friend Ephraim Halevi, who was the head of Mossad, who's a very wise and sensible commentator in his retirement, has said very clearly that there was a failure. And I mean, there have been human failures before by Israel. For example, if you take the Hezbollah war of 2006, exactly the same thing happened then. And clearly the Israelis didn't have sufficient penetration of the strategic and planning part of Hezbollah. And I think in this particular case, they didn't have, as it were, inside coverage at a senior strategic level of the Hamas leadership. And I'm certainly of the view that the attack was largely planned anyway by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And one of the reasons it was successful is that, they managed to do it in such a way as to catch the Israelis out and not have given them warning of what was planned.
Noting the role you had, it's just been an extraordinary failure because presumably Mossad normally are world-class operatives, aren't they? And at the IDF and Israel Defence.
Mossad are an outstanding service, but, all services, espionage is about human behaviour. You can never get it 100% right all the time.
That's good.
Anyway.
Let's go back to some questions. Eileen is in Blantyre. Eileen, your question. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Sir Richard. It's fascinating listening
It is, I agree.
to you. I'm puzzled and baffled by the lack of power of the sanctions that the government have placed. What's the restriction, with all your knowledge, Sir Richard, what's the restriction in using the seized assets, physical and monetary, to support Ukraine?
Well, this is, of course, came up. Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, said that there would be sanctions. As of yesterday, it amounted to, my understanding is 6 prison bosses who were in charge of the prison where Alexander Navalny was murdered, to use Sir Richard's words, having any assets they might have in the UK frozen. There is $300 billion worth of assets across the UK, the US and the EU. Should we try to seize some of those? And a general response to that question, Sir Richard.
Well, I think we should try to seize them. But, there are 2 aspects to sanctions. They're symbolic and they're practical. It's very easy to take a sanctions decision. They're hard to enforce. And the Russians are very good at evading them. I'm thinking now of the larger economic sanctions on the Russian economy. Any sanctions policy has huge enforcement problems, and seizure of assets is a somewhat different issue. And there are legal barriers to doing that. But I think that, as Bob Zoellick said, the retired head of the World Bank, he has sort of mounted an initiative in the United States to look at overcoming the legal problems so that those Russian assets, which are spread around the world, can be used to compensate for Ukraine's massive strategic and economic losses.
Someone who worked very closely with Alexei Navalny described the British sanctions as flaccid. That seems accurate?
Well, I fear that, we aren't a major player internationally when it comes to sanctions enforcement. There's a long history of sanctions only doing part of the job. You need cohesion amongst the international community for a very, very effective sanctions response. And we haven't got that at the moment in relation to Ukraine.
A couple more from the text, tweets and emails. Pierre in Kent. The newspapers are saying that Navalny was murdered by a death punch to the heart. Is Sir Richard familiar with this tactic? ?
Well, I think this is part of what's called the training of Russian Spetsnaz, Spetsnaz of their special forces. And they do use these sort of weird techniques. They also have a symbolic weapon, which is a sharpened trenching tool, which they also use for hand-to-hand fighting. So there are lots of sort of Spetsnaz myths, and this is one of them.
There is no such thing as a death punch.
No, I think there is probably a death punch. I think there is a way of. Look, I'm not an expert on these things, so I'm not going.
Well, you're closer to it than I am.
I'm not going to speculate.
Presumably,
much
if I
further.
hit you hard enough with enough force, and I get the angle right, I'm going to kill you.
Think of the example of that Australian batsman who was hit.
Oh God.
I mean, that's an precise parallel. He was hit by the cricket ball above his heart. His heart stopped and it killed him. So yes, this is a possibility.
Graham in Bushy, is a second President Trump term a worry for Europe?
Indeed, it is at the moment. I think it's a serious worry, and particularly given what Trump has said about NATO. Look, there is one practical, beneficial aspect of Trump's attitude to NATO when he, in his first term, when he called out NATO for member countries for not spending sufficient on their defence budgets.
He was right to do that.
He was right to do that, in my view. They were massively underspent and we were relying too much on the American umbrella. Now, times have changed. By the time Trump comes to power, if he does come to power, and I rather hope he doesn't, but, I can't interfere in that debate, then most member countries will be spending above 2% of GDP. So let's hope that he will act more responsible with regard to NATO, although his recent statements are very, very worrying indeed, particularly for a country like the UK.
NATO couldn't continue without the US, could it?
In my view, it couldn't, no.
Someone you'll know well, Sir John Sawyer, sat in your seat where you are now a few months ago, told me he'd be, quotes, horrified at the idea of Trump returning to the White House. Did you use that word?
I don't think I would quite use that word, because there are aspects of Trump's policy which, for example, he made us all rethink policy on China.
Let's get another call. Hassan in Slough. Hassan, your question. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, and first of all, thank you for your service.
Indeed.
Sir
Well
Richard.
said. Well said.
I'm a Muslim myself, and I've dealt with Muslim extremism in the 90s and when I stood for Parliament in the 2000s, and I did work with Prevent, which is a good strategy. I'd very much like to know what drives that sort of extremism, because when I came face to face with them, the explanation they gave was Western intervention in the Middle East or big Zionist conspiracy to destroy Islam. I reject both explanations. So what do you think drives them? And connected to that is, do you think there's an impending danger of an Islamic invasion of Europe and America, as espoused by many people on the right and implied by Suella Braverman?
Two big questions there. The first one, of course, I need to say a concerning rise in Islamism, in anti-Islamism, and of course anti-Semitism as well. Sir Richard, let's address that one first.
Okay. Well, I think one of the characteristics of 20th century politics has been the rise of political Islam. And political Islam has been a great empowerment in the Arab world. But the problem with political Islam is that it has embraced and encouraged and used extremist radicalization. And we all have seen the results of that. So it has a very negative side to it as well. And, it has influenced the Muslim diaspora across Europe quite significantly. And we've all seen what the consequences of that have been. Look, the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly in our own country, I find massively worrying. And I find that the sort of apparent street sympathy for Hamas and the lack of understanding of what Hamas as an organization represents also I find worrying. And I hope that, people like me, like you, Hassan, because it's a brilliant question, who have had direct experience of these things and travelled extensively in the Middle East and been involved there politically with various leaders, can help people understand why these situations are so dangerous and really introduce a very, very negative aspect into our domestic politics.
Should action be taken when protesters put slogans such as "From the River to the Sea" on Big Ben?
I'm afraid they certainly should.
Are you disappointed they weren't?
I'm absolutely disappointed in the Metropolitan Police for that lack of reaction.
To Hassan's second point, this idea of some form of invasion, can you briefly address that, Sir Richard, that Hassan referred to?
Well, I think invasion is a difficult word. Look, we are living in a period of mass migration, and obviously the influence and size of Muslim communities throughout Europe is growing because of numbers. But I think that we need, to accommodate that within our democracy, and I would like to see our Muslim communities, absorbed and being a very positive part of that democracy, and a good chunk of those communities are, and we have no reason to criticize them. So I would be reluctant to, be too provocative in that description of using the word invasion. It has difficult connotations.
Lastly, and I'm sorry to the many calls we can't get to, you have no idea how many questions I've not put forward to you, such as how do you like your martini and what is Judi Dench like at portraying you on screen. I've held back from all of them.
I did have lunch with Judi Dench before she took on the role of M in the movies. That was one of the most enjoyable lunches of my life.
Is she good value?
She's fantastic, and I hope she remembers that lunch with me.
And did you enjoy her portrayal? You've led me down this path now.
Oh, I thought it was superb.
But here's one I am. This is from Guy in Winchester. Could Sir Richard possibly tell us the best or coolest gadget he's ever dispensed or come across, of course, as long as it's not a state secret?
That's a difficult one without portraying. Let's go back to Judi Dench.
Okay, yeah.
When she came to lunch, she was given a miniature camera, actually a commercially available miniature camera, which was originally made by the East Germans, called a Minox, which is sort of famous in the world of espionage. And engraved on the body of the camera was from C to M.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Let's mention that podcast again. One Decision with Sir Richard Dearlove and your colleague, journalist Julia McFarlane. Thanks for all your time. Look after yourself, sir.
Nick, thanks. That was great fun and very interesting and great questions from our listeners.